Years after Russia launched a half-heartedly concealed invasion of Ukraine's Crimean peninsula under the guise of helping supposedly oppressed Russian speakers and Russia loyalists in the area, in February of 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This invasion followed months of military buildup along the two countries' shared borders and was called a special military operation by Russian President Putin. It was later reported that this was intended to be a quick, maybe 2-day decapitation attack against Ukraine, Russia's forces rapidly closing the distance between the border and Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, killing or imprisoning all of the country's leadership, replacing it with a puppet government loyal to Putin, and that would be that. Ukraine had been reorienting toward the European Union and away from Russia's sphere of influence, and Russia wanted to put a stop to that realignment and bring the country fully back under its control, as was the case before 2014, when a series of protests turned into an uprising that caused their then leader, a puppet of Russia, to flee the country. He, of course, fled to Russia. On paper, Ukraine was at a massive disadvantage in this renewed conflict, as Russia is a global-scale player, while Ukraine is relatively small and back in 2014 had one of its major ports and a huge chunk of its territory stolen by Russia. Russia also has nukes, has a massive conventional military, and has a far larger economy and population. Analysts near universally assumed Ukraine would collapse under the weight of Russia's military, perhaps holding out for a few weeks or maybe even months if they were really skillful and lucky, but probably just days. That did not end up being the case. Despite Russia's substantial and multifarious advantages, Ukraine managed to hold out against the initial invasion, against subsequent pushes, and then managed to launch its own counterattacks, taking back some of the land that was initially claimed by Russia. For more than 3 years, it has held its ground against Russia's onslaught, against continuous land incursions, and against seemingly endless aerial attacks by jets, by bombers, and by all sorts of rockets and missiles and drones. It is difficult, if not impossible, to determine casualty and fatality numbers in this conflict, as both sides are incentivized to adjust these figures, either to show how horrible the other side is, or to make it seem like they are suffering less than they are for morale purposes. But it's expected that Russia will hit a milestone of 1 million casualties sometime in the summer of 2025, if it hasn't actually hit that number already, and it's estimated that as many as 250,000 Russian soldiers have already been killed in Ukraine. Now, for context, that is about 5 times as many deaths as Russia suffered in all the wars it fought post-World War II, as both the Soviet Union and Russia combined. That is also 15 times as many fatalities as they suffered in their 10-year-long war in Afghanistan, and 10 times as many deaths as in their 13-year-long war in Chechnya. It's also estimated that Russia has lost something like 3,000 to 4,000 tanks, 9,000 armored vehicles, 13,000 artillery systems, and more than 400 air defense systems in the past year alone. Those numbers vary quite a bit depending on who you listen to, but those are likely the proper orders of magnitude at the bare minimum. The country is rapidly shifting to a full-scale war footing, originally having intended to make do with a few modern systems and a whole lot of antique Soviet-era military hardware that they had in storage to conduct this blitzkrieg attack on Ukraine. But now they are having to reorient basically every facet of society and their economy toward this conflict, turning a huge chunk of their total manufacturing base toward producing ammunition, tanks, missiles, and so on, which, to be clear, is something that they are capable of doing. Russia is currently on pace to replace this hardware and then some, which is part of why other European governments are increasing their own military spending right now. The idea being that once Russia has finished their reorientation toward the production of modern military hardware, they will eventually find themselves with more tanks and missiles and drones than they can use in Ukraine, and they will need to aim all that stuff somewhere, or else will find themselves having to pay upkeep on all of this stuff as it gathers dust and slowly becomes unusable. The theory, then, is that they will have to open up another conflict just to avoid being bogged down in too much surplus weaponry. So maybe they'll try their luck in the Baltics. Or perhaps they'll start shipping more hardware to fellow travelers, terrorists and separatists mostly, in places like Moldova. In the meantime, though, Russian forces are continuing to accrue gains in Ukraine, but very, very slowly. This year, they have captured an average of about 50 meters of Ukrainian territory per day at a cost of around 1,140 casualties per day, of which about 975 are fatalities. That is a huge and horrific meat grinder. But there's little pushback against the invasion inside Russia at this point, as speaking out against it has been thoroughly criminalized, and a lot of high-profile fines and arrests and kidnappings and seeming assassinations of people who have said anything even a little bit negative about the war or the Russian government have apparently been effective. Ukraine is holding its own then, but Russia still has the upper hand and will likely have even more weight behind it in the coming months as its manufacturing base pivots further and further toward a total war stance. What I'd like to talk about today is a seeming renewed effort on the part of Ukraine to strike within Russian territory, taking out military assets, but also destabilizing Russian support for the war, focusing especially on one such recent, wildly successful asymmetric attack. You're listening to Let's Know Things. I'm Colin Wright. I'm able to keep this show ad-free because of support from listeners like you. If you're finding value in what I'm doing here, consider becoming a paid supporter for the cost of a cup of coffee each month at letsknowthings.com. And as a thank you for your helping me keep this show solvent, you'll receive an additional bonus More Things episode each month. All right, let's get back to the show. In addition to all the other advantages Russia has in this conflict, Ukraine's population is about 1/4 the size of Russia's. And that means even if Ukraine is, by some measures, losing just one soldier to every 2 that Russia loses, over time Russia is still gaining firmer and firmer footing. That is a war of attrition that Russia will eventually win just because their population is bigger. By some indications, the Russian government is also using this conflict as an opportunity to clear out its prisons, offering prisoners a chance at freedom if they go to the front line and survive for a period of time. Many of them dying at the front line, and some of them sent back to the front line over and over again despite what they were promised. And this thus frees up prison space and resources that would otherwise be spent on these prisoners. But they are also sending a disproportionate number of their poor, their disliked ethnic and religious groups, and their young radicals into the meat grinder, forcing them to serve as cannon fodder, as most of those people will die or be grievously wounded. But those people also, as a side benefit, will no longer be a problem or as much of a problem for the Russian government. Russia is also bringing in troops from its ally, North Korea, to fight on the front lines, alongside all the weapons systems and ammo it's been procuring from them and other allies like China and Iran. So while this is obviously not great for Russia, losing that many fighters for relatively small gains, they have also figured out a way to make it not so bad, and in some ways even a positive development, according to their metrics for positive anyway. And again, if they can keep warm bodies flooding to the front lines, they will eventually win, even if it takes a while. At their current rate of advance, it would take about 116 years to capture the rest of the country. so perhaps a long while. But that is potentially sustainable for them, even if the body count is shockingly high already, and even more so by the time they take enough of the country to win a convincing victory. To counter this increasing advantage that Russia has been leveraging, Ukraine has been leaning more heavily on drones as the invasion has progressed. Now, in this context, a drone might be anything from an off-the-shelf quadcopter model of the kind that hobbyists use all over the world to race and to shoot aerial photography, to higher-end jet or missile or glider-like models, similar to what major military forces like the US military used to scout and photograph enemy forces in terrain, and in some cases to launch assassination attacks or bombing raids on the same. They can be low-flying quadcopters, or they can be something like lingering unmanned missiles or jet fighters then. And they can be completely unarmed, or they can be rigged with grenades to drop, bombs to use in a suicide attack, missiles to fire, shotguns to blast enemy fighters in the face, or nets to ensnare enemy drones. Drones of all shapes and sizes have been fundamental to the way modern militaries operate since the 1990s, when early remotely piloted aircraft, like the US Predator drone, were used for aerial reconnaissance purposes in mostly Middle Eastern war zones. Later versions were then equipped with bombs and missiles, and in some cases have even been used for the assassination of individuals, as was the case with a drone that fired a modified Hellfire missile that was reportedly used to kill an al-Qaeda leader in Afghanistan in 2022. The missile deploying 6 large blades before hitting its intended target, shredding him instead of blowing him up, and thus avoiding civilian casualties. Mexican cartels have also been enthusiastically adopting drones in their attacks and assassinations. Their so-called dronero, drone operators, often rigging off-the-shelf drones with deployable bombs, allowing them to fly the drone into an enemy's home or other supposedly safe space, killing them with minimum risk to the attacker, and with sufficient fog of war so that if the attacker doesn't want to be known, they can maintain their anonymity. Ukraine's military has been using drones from the beginning of the conflict in a similarly asymmetric manner, but they've also been improving upon the state-of-the-art by coming up with sophisticated new uses for existing drone models, while also developing their own drones and software systems, allowing them to maintain the meat grinder Russian forces face with fewer Ukrainian casualties, while also giving them new opportunities to strike Russia within its own borders. That latter point is important, as for pretty much this entire conflict, Ukraine's allies have provided them with weapons, but with the stipulation that they cannot fire those weapons into Russian territory. And sometimes they even modify the hardware before sending it to Ukraine's military to make it so it can't shoot as far as it's technically capable of shooting. The fear being that Russia might use an attack using these weapons into their territory as justification to expand the scope of the conflict. You used an American-made artillery piece to hit a target within our borders. We are now at war with America. Those stipulations have been lightening, with some allies now saying it is fine that Ukraine uses these weapons however they like, but the Ukrainians have been pushed into making more of their own weapon systems, in part because they can use those systems however they choose without any limits, including being able to target infrastructure within Russian territory. One such innovation is a speedboat-based anti-aircraft missile system called the Magura V7, which reportedly shot down 2 Russian Su-30 warplanes, which are roughly equivalent to the US's F-16 in May of 2025, which was the first ever successful downing of fighter jets by drone boats. These boats can hang out in open water for days at a time, watching and waiting for Russian jets, and then ambushing them seemingly out of nowhere. It's also been speculated that a recent attack on a vital supply channel for Russian forces in occupied Crimea, the Crimean Bridge, was conducted using an underwater drone, which, if true, could signal a new frontier of sorts in this conflict, as Ukraine has already managed to menace Russia's Black Sea Fleet into near inoperability using conventional weaponry, and the widespread deployment of more difficult-to-detect underwater drones could make any Russian naval presence even more difficult, if not impossible, to maintain. Ukraine has been coming up with all sorts of interesting countermeasures for Russia's anti-drone tech, including connecting their spy drones to the drone's operator, using miles, in some cases up to 10 miles, of thin strands of fiber optic cable, which renders electronic warfare countermeasures all but useless, alongside efforts to make attack drones more capable if cut off from their operators, allowing the drones to continue tracking targets over time and to follow through with an intended attack if their communication signals are jammed. A new approach to offensively leveraging drones, which was the biggest drone attack by Ukraine so far and the most impactful against Russia, was called Operation Spider's Web and was deployed on June 1st of this year. It involved 117 drones launching coordinated attacks across Russia, successfully striking about 20 high-end Russian military aircraft, 10 of which were destroyed. This is notable in part because some of the aircraft in question were strategic bombers and A-50 military spy planes, both of which are incredibly expensive and valuable, and Russia only has 2 of that type of spy plane. Now, they only have 1, presumably. But it's also notable because some of these targets were struck far from Ukraine. One of the targeted air bases located about 2,700 miles away, which for context is nearly the width of the continental United States. The Ukrainian military was able to accomplish this synchronized attack, which took about a year and a half to plan, by concealing drone parts in wooden shipping containers that were designed to look like a type of mobile wooden cabin that are commonly carried on flatbed trucks throughout the area. These parts were assembled into finished drones inside Russia's borders, and then on June 1st, all at the same time, the roofs of these mobile containers slid open, the drones flew out, and they made for their targets simultaneously. This attack is said to have caused billions of dollars in damage and to have hit about a third of Russia's cruise missile carriers. Earlier this week, Russia launched what's being called the biggest overnight drone bombardment of the war so far, launching 479 drones at Ukrainian targets, alongside 20 missiles of different types. The Ukrainian military says it destroyed 277 drones and 19 missiles mid-flight, and that only 10 drones and missiles hit their targets. One person was reportedly injured by the barrage, though, like all numbers in this conflict, it is impossible to know whether those figures are real or not. This is of a kind with other recent attacks by Russia against Ukrainian targets, in that it was aimed at several military but also many major civilian targets, apparently with the intention of demoralizing civilians and soldiers alike. And most of these attacks are overnight attacks because it's more difficult to see the drones and take them out before they hit their target when it's dark outside. For their part, the Russian military continues to say they only strike military targets, but they've been saying that throughout the war, and it has consistently not been true. That said, there are some murmurs in the analyst community that Russia might not be able to escalate things too much right now, despite the big success of Operation Spider's Web, as it's already throwing a lot at Ukraine. Both countries are seemingly going all out in their offensives on the theory that if peace talks do ever go anywhere, as some foreign governments, including Trump's US government, would prefer, the side that seems to be doing the best and to have the best prospects at that moment will have an advantage in those talks. They will have more leverage. Ukraine's attacks within Russia have mostly targeted fuel and ammo depots, drone manufacturing facilities, and similar invasion-related infrastructure. There is a chance they might also aim at demoralizing the Russian public through attacks on civilian targets at some point, but they seem to be sticking with military targets for now, and that would seem to be a better strategy, considering that speaking out against the war is illegal and severely punished in Russia, so hitting Russia's capacity for maintaining the invasion would seem to be more likely to lead to positive outcomes for Ukraine, as that could hobble Russia's capacity to invade, which in turn could then reduce the population's sense of the government's power and perhaps even invulnerability. However those talks, if they do eventually happen in earnest, play out, there is apparently now a change in tone and tact, as Ukraine has shown that it is capable of striking Russian targets deep within Russia. And it's likely making things tricky for Russia's economy, as they will now have to spend more time and resources checking all sorts of shipping containers and other possible points of ingress, lest they contain drone parts or other weapons. Not a huge deal, all things considered perhaps, a little extra work and expense across their economy. But it is one more of many paper cuts Ukraine seems to be inflicting on its more powerful foe that, in aggregate, might eventually force that foe to find a way to back off. The book I'd like to recommend today is called The Burning Earth, An Environmental History of the Last 500 Years by Sunil Amrith. I'm going to read the publisher-provided summary for this book, as I think it's a whole lot better than any summary that I could provide for what is a very varied and sprawling historical work. Quote, ever since innovations in agriculture vastly expanded production of the staples of food energy, our remarkable achievements in reshaping nature have brought about an overwhelming expansion in the life chances of billions of people. Yet every technological innovation has also empowered humans to exploit each other and the planet with devastating brutality, twinning the stories of environment and of empire, genocide and ecocide, as with Spanish silver mining in Peru and British gold mining in South Africa. After the Age of Empire, new nations raced to make up lost ground, expanding human freedom at devastating ecological cost. Now, if any of that sounds interesting to you, consider picking up a copy of The Burning Earth by Sunil Amrith. Let's Know Things is a listener-supported show. I don't make any money from ads, only what listeners contribute by becoming paid supporters at letsknowthings.com. If you're not in the position to become a paid supporter at the moment, consider leaving a quick review wherever you get your pods. Those help get the show in front of more people and lend a hint of credibility to independently made shows like this one. A huge thanks in advance, whatever shape your support might take.